McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome to the program. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and I'm here with my co-host, Jim Falk. And Jim, this program is about money and politics, something near and dear to your heart. So why don't you give that viewer some idea of what we're going to do?
Well, by all the letters I've been getting in the mail lately, I think it's something that we ought to reform.
For sure.
The 2018 midterm election was the most expensive ever, with Senate and House candidates spending $2.1 billion and more than $436 million was directed to super PACs. Most of the American public believes that there is too much money in politics. I certainly do. In response, there is a movement to limit campaign spending via the passage of a constitutional amendment that, if passed, would be the 28th. Joining us via Skype is Jim Rubens. He's a former two-term Republican state senator in New Hampshire. Jim is also the New England chair of the Take Back Our Republic. Working with American Promise, Jim led the successful effort that made New Hampshire the 20th state to formally call on Congress to pass and return to the states for ratification the proposed amendment. Welcome to the program, Jim.
Great to be here.
And here in the studio with us is Drumm. She is the North Texas organizer of American Promise, which works for a constitutional amendment to address big money in politics. Long active in Dallas environmental issues, this year she added democracy reform to her advocacy efforts. She earned her undergraduate and law degrees at Southern Methodist University. Great to have you with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with you, Ann. Do we need campaign finance reform?
We need a constitutional amendment to address the problem of big money in politics. We have a system that is out of balance. Those with more money have more political power, and the voices of ordinary Americans are being drowned out by special interests and concentrated capital. We have big issues facing this country that are going unaddressed. The needs and interests of ordinary Americans are going unaddressed. But as you pointed out in the introduction, we have the American public on our side. We know that we have broad bipartisan support for a 28th Amendment to get big money out of politics. And so we're very hopeful that we are going to have that amendment in the next few years.
And we're seeing this level of money, this increase at every level, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
I remember here just in Dallas, we had the mayoral election and there was an enormous amount of money spent there.
The problem of money in politics has filtered down from Congress to state races down to local races. Another example is in the city of Seattle. Amazon invested $1.5 million to influence the outcome of Seattle City Council races. Imagine that.
Yeah, but why wouldn't they? Because Seattle City Council is trying to tax them and tax their employees. I can make the case, Ann, that they're just trying to protect themselves from politicians who are overreaching.
But if you are an ordinary citizen in a city who wants to step forward and run to represent your neighbor's interests on the city council, and you have to raise money to compete against a corporate behemoth that has $1.5 million to throw away to in a city council election, it really disadvantages you from the outset.
Yeah, but you've got socialists, avowed socialists on the city council there. If I am a laissez-faire capitalist pig, which I am, then I'm going to try to protect myself from socialists on that city council in Seattle. Why shouldn't I?
So, I'm sorry, why shouldn't you protect yourself from the socialists on the Seattle City Council? Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to level the playing field, okay? So this 28th Amendment is not going to advantage one particular political party over another. It's not going to advantage one economic worldview over another. What we're trying to do is level the playing field so that the voices of concentrated capital don't drown out the voices of ordinary citizens.
So, and give me the specifics. What is entailed in this proposed 28th Amendment?
Well, the 28th Amendment would change what the Supreme Court did in a line of cases where it adopted an extreme and damaging interpretation of First Amendment free speech provisions. So the court did put two ideas together. The first was the idea that corporations and unions and other artificial entities created by state law are people. And
that's Citizens United.
Well, it actually goes back, it precedes Citizens United. It goes back to Buckley versus Vallejo, which is the 1976 decision. So this idea first that these artificial entities are people, and then that political spending is speech. And so when it put those two ideas together, it said that corporations, unions, special interests, wealthy individuals can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence the outcome of elections because that political spending is speech protected under the First Amendment. So we need the 28th Amendment to redefine political spending as something that is distinct from speech so that Congress and the states once again have the right to place reasonable restrictions on money that's spent to influence our political outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, Ann. Thank you. And to Jim Rubens, make sure we get the gems right, Jim. One of the things that Ann mentioned, and I think is true, in that most people believe that there's probably too much money in politics, and yet there are very few Republicans like you. In fact, I think only one Republican has signed on in Congress to support this. Why is it that it seems like it's a Democratic movement as opposed to a cross-partisan movement?
Well, Republicans are waking up now to the reality that as of 2018, the playing field has changed. Republicans used to be better at this big money game than Democrats. 2018, I'll just talk about my state of New Hampshire. 2018, we had a Republican-controlled House, State Senate, Executive Council. All of them flipped Democrat because huge sums of out-of-state money came into New Hampshire. And again, they flipped the entire political control, other than our governor in New Hampshire, out-of-state control. I ran for U.S. Senate in 2016, Republican primary, and then Republican versus Democrat. $135 million was spent on one U.S. Senate seat. A Democrat won. $135 million. 95% of that money came from out of state. And this is why Republicans are waking up to the problem. Number one, federalism, the 10th Amendment, is being washed out. It's being extinguished because the out-of-state money is flooding into almost every swing district, and including, as Ann says, down to state legislative races. Out-of-state money is replacing the views of local voters. It's supplanting the needs, the differing needs of different states like New Hampshire and Texas, and it's destroying these laboratories of democracy that allow us and the different states to test different approaches to problem solving, policy problem solving, in a way that allows other states to replicate successes. So we are the United States of America. The 10th Amendment is part of our Constitution, and this big money system is wiping it out. So that's problem number one. Federalism is being lost. Problem number two, and the reason Republicans are catching up on this, is because Republicans are not any longer better at the big money game. The Democrats are better than us now, so we better catch up and fix this problem. And there are other, I'll wait for more questions, but there are other problems that really concern conservatives.
Well, indeed, as you mentioned, we've even seen big money in city council races here in Dallas. One of the things that I was wondering about as well is I'd like you to go into more detail about what American Promise does. What does it stand for? Well,
first, let's start with the name, our American Promise. It is the promise of equal citizenship. So it is the promise in our Constitution that we are created equal, that we have the right to participate equally in the political process, and that we're entitled to equal representation. So American Promise is a national, cross-partisan, grassroots advocacy organization that works on, laser focused on this solution, the 28th Amendment, to the problem of big money in politics. And I'm like many other volunteers in American Promise, I'm organizing in my community. So I'm organizing to build public support and to educate the public in North Texas about the problem of big money in politics and why we need the 28th Amendment to address it.
So it's really a grassroots organization. Do you have chapters?
We do. We have chapters all around the country. And we have, ours is the first chapter in Texas, I'm proud to say. But the organization is based in the Boston area. It was founded about 3 years ago by Jeff Clements and John Wass. And it's got chapters around the country of volunteers like me using different strategies to build support and educate the public about the need to have this amendment to fix big money in politics.
Yeah, and I think, as you pointed out, most everybody believes there's too much money in politics regardless of where they are. Why do you think that is? Why is there so much money in politics today versus, let's say, 40, 50 years ago? I'm talking relatively speaking as well.
Well, the law changed. The court's interpretation of free speech changed, and that completely altered the landscape.
So you think it's the law, the Vallejo law and Citizens United, that caused all this additional money to be spent?
The growth of super PACs?
It is the change in the constitutional interpretation that enabled the growth of super PACs. It was actually a D.C. Circuit case shortly after Citizens United that created the super PAC. And if you look at the data from the website Open Secrets is one of the sources that I use when I'm talking to audiences about this, because they have a graph that shows what has happened to political spending in federal elections over the last few years. And what you see is, for many years, you know, it kind of looked like this. And then after 2010, you start seeing it just skyrocket. It just took off. You mentioned the 2018 midterm elections, but in the 2016 presidential cycle, the outside spending by super PACs and wealthy individuals, it reached almost $1.5 billion. And when you look at that on Open Secrets graph, it's just mind-boggling how much worse the problem is than it used to be.
Okay. So let me focus in a little bit different from that. I agree that people have been able to spend more and in different ways because of those issues. But here's, I guess, this is a table right here in front of us. Let's say that this table, I don't know, it looks like a pretty beat up table to me. Let's say this table's worth $100. If we were bidding for this table, how much more than $100 do you think people would pay?
I'm not following your question.
Well, I mean, if the table's worth $100, you think probably $100 is pretty much what it's going to bring? I mean, unless we're giving it away at auction, we're the philanthropic thing.
Sure.
So somebody running for Congress, and Jim just ran for Senate. And Jim, what is the salary of a senator right now?
Well, it's under $200,000 a year, but you got to remember that the typical half of U.S. senators, when they retire, they earn in the range of $2, $3, $4, $5 million a year, becoming lobbyists.
Yes. Okay, so here's my question then, Jim, to follow up with what I was asking Ann. So let's say it's under $200,000 a year. Why would somebody spend millions of dollars to buy a $200,000 a year job?
Well, as I mentioned, for the U.S. senator and congressman, you can exit the job of being a senator, and you can make extraordinary sums of money. And as you notice, many people who get into office become quite rich during their term of office. But even more than that, what we're seeing in government as a result, direct consequence of this big money system, we are seeing government growing. And I'm coming at this from a conservative standpoint. First of all, I should add 66%, 2 out of 3 Republicans back this amendment we're talking about here to allow Congress and the states to take back control over this out of control spending thing. So we've got the system is causing an explosion of spending and debt. We're going to look at gargantuan tax increases because low taxes come from low spending. We're looking at spending $1 trillion a year in excess of what we raise in revenues as a direct consequence of this big money system. Both parties Everyone who gets in office wants more money because the people who buy elections, the people who spend all the money, want more spending for their particular interest group.
Okay,
So,
good. Now you have answered my question, Jim. Thank you very much.
Jim, what I wanted to know, though, should there be restrictions on what individual candidates can spend? I mean, right now we have two billionaires running against a billionaire president.
The amendment that we're backing allows Congress and the states to set reasonable limits on both spending and contributions. So should Congress want to limit the amount that a union can contribute to a political party, this gives Congress the power to do that. Should Congress or the states wish to limit the amount a candidate or a PAC or some third-party entity can spend on an election, Congress and the states are empowered to do that. So this amendment that we're talking about here would allow that. That's going to be up to Congress.
How realistic is it, though, really, to pass this amendment? There have already been 12,000 efforts or so to have an amendment, and what we have 27 now.
Well, we think it's quite realistic because we know we have the American public's support behind us. So there was a poll out of the University of Maryland in 2018 asking the question, do you support a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics? And as Jim has pointed out, 66% of Republicans said yes, 70% of independents said yes, and 85% of Democrats said yes. So we are starting at a place of a high level of public support. What we are trying to do is help the public understand that it is actually possible to get a constitutional amendment. It's not easy, but it is possible. And we have a goal that we will have the amendment passed out of Congress by 2022 and ratified by the states by 2026.
All right, and what it calls for specifically, it's very short, what is specifically what it calls for?
So the amendment says that Congress and the states may pass reasonable regulations to address the raising and spending of money to influence the outcome of elections. What the amendment does is it removes the obstacle that the Supreme Court put in the way when it equated political spending with free speech. Once you remove that obstacle, then Congress will write the rules pertaining to federal elections. States will write the rules pertaining to state elections. And the rules that Texas will write will be rules appropriate for Texas, and those are going to very likely be different from the rules that California or New York writes. But that's the way it should be, and this amendment will give Texas the flexibility to write rules that are appropriate for it.
But if Jim is right, and I think he is, I mean, people won't spend millions of dollars to make him rich when he gets out of office. You know, that will happen because that's how corrupt the system is. But the government is so big, there's so many goodies to have, and the government spends over $4 trillion, the federal government, over $4 trillion a year, only taxes a little over $3 trillion, so we got this $1 trillion deficit he's talking about. It seems to me that I don't know how you can limit people trying to buy something when it's something that is so big. It's not this table. I wish it were this table. But if there are so many goodies, so many government programs, so much corruption, defense, everything you can imagine, not to mention all the entitlement programs, there's money that goes to the private sector everywhere. That's why they're going to continue to spend legally or, I'm afraid to say, illegally.
Well, you know, you talk about the private sector, and what we have is a situation right now where entities that have amassed large amounts of economic power, they've been successful in the marketplace, they now have a disproportionate amount of political power. And so we think that we need to separate out the economic and the political spheres. Just because you've been successful in the marketplace does not mean that you should have disproportionate political power. And so the way you separate out those economic spheres is by making it very clear with the constitutional amendment that economic power and political power are different, and the rights of natural persons and the rights of artificial entities created by state law are different too.
And I'm not sure if companies might not be relieved not to have some restrictions put on
Well,
them.
some will, because they get basically extorted into spending money on the other side, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, there's such pressure put on companies to give to various things, and if one automobile company's doing it, well, then Ford has to do it. And
Well, the pressure goes both ways. It goes from elected officials to companies, and it goes back the other way. But that's because we're caught up in this money arms race. You know, there's never an end to it. You never get a letter from your elected official saying, "Thank you, I have enough money now."
But one of the problems, too, is that the whole process is too long. I mean, as soon as we get through next year's election, we'll be running for president again.
That's called the Perpetual Campaign.
And is there any discussion about trying to address that?
Well,
Or there'd be a shorter period where you could raise money like they have in other countries?
yeah, I think there might be a First Amendment problem with that, and that's one of the topics that we discuss at the events that we create. We have these 28th Amendment town halls, writing the 28th Amendment workshops, where citizens and constitutional law scholars and activists can come together to talk about what exactly should the language of the amendment be and why. And so that's an example of the kind of a discussion that could be had at one of those workshops where we hammer out the language. Can we place a limit on the amount of time that we spend campaigning and have that be constitutional under the First Amendment?
Yeah, and Jim Rubens, I know that it probably even in the state Senate where you served there, that you probably spend more of your time than you wanted to raising money. I know that in the Senate in D.C. and the House, they spend so much time raising money. And yet, it just seems to me that until you lower the size of government by about 75%, which is sort of where I'd be coming from, that you're going to continue to have people spending money either trying to game the system and get something from it, or, as Ann mentioned, the case of Amazon trying to protect themselves from that particular situation in Seattle.
Well, this amendment is not intended, and it won't solve all the problems we've got in the country, but we are at a constitutional amending moment. There's a surge in support for things like the balanced budget amendment to impose fiscal restraint. I back this on Congress. There is a growing movement to impose term limits on Congress. So we're at a point when the American public, in huge majorities, believe that political corruption is out of control in Washington. But back to your question about how does this tie into growing government? It does, because, again, we have both parties electing people to office, major sums of money, getting people elected to office because they're willing to spend more money now on whatever the special interest wants. And this is causing an explosion of debt. So I can tie this issue to the growth of government, to the growth of debt, and to a likely surge of gargantuan tax increases to pay for this $1 trillion, as far as the eye can see, flow of deficits we've got right now. I should add another point also, that this system is directly causing the replacement of free market capitalism by what some people are calling crony capitalism, pay-to-play politics. Business hates this. 2 out of 3 people in business despise the fact that they can be extorted by candidates and politicians. If you don't support me, I'm going to pass some kind of regulation or allow it to be imposed upon you adverse to your interest. Business is sick and tired of this money game. And the problem also with pay-to-play crony capitalism, business, instead of going to the consumer and offering better products and services, they're now going to Washington looking for regulatory favors, tax breaks, pork contracts. You can go to Washington, and for every dollar you spend, and this is documented now, for every dollar you spend on campaign contributions and lobbying, you get between $760 and $1,000 back for every dollar you spend. It's more profitable for business to go to Washington and grow crony capitalism than it is to serve consumers. And the problem with this is young people, the majority of young people, see this erosion of free market capitalism. They see the crony capitalism, and they now favor socialism over free market capitalism. This should be of serious concern to free market conservatives. And this is among the reasons that I believe that conservatives are going to climb on board, sick and tired of seeing federalism eroded, sick and tired of the endless growth of spending, and want to protect free market capitalism.
Well, I think that's a good way of putting it. And so, since you are a Republican, why don't you send a little tweet, I suppose, to President Trump in his next State of the Union address to ask him to at least mention the budget deficit and the debt, something he hasn't done since he's been elected. So if I may take that shot at the Republicans.
Well, both of you make good arguments, so how can people get involved and support this initiative?
Well, we have a very active chapter here in North Texas. We launched it in April when we had one of these Writing the 28th Amendment workshops at SMU. And so we are building teams in North Texas and having our volunteers approach city councils to ask city councils to pass resolutions to support the 28th Amendment. The reason we're doing this is because the city council resolution is evidence of public support for the amendment. In the last 9 years, 804 cities and towns around the country have passed these kinds of resolutions, calling on Congress to send an amendment to the states for ratifications. 20 state legislatures have also passed resolutions. So we're looking to get more resolutions out of our city councils. We're also talking to people who are running for election in North Texas. So if people are interested in getting involved, they can email us americanpromisentx@gmail.com.
Very good. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for joining us, and as always, it's great to see you. While the U.S. Constitution is a living document, the framers made it notoriously difficult to modify. Notwithstanding that fact, campaign finance reform has growing bipartisan support and a movement of community activists promoting passage of a constitutional amendment. We can expect that this issue will continue to be at the forefront and hotly debated in the Congress and around the dinner table. Follow us on Twitter, check McCuistionTV.com for other important topics, and thanks for tuning in as we talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.